The empire didn't crumble overnight. It began with whispers. Agents closing in, shipments vanishing, loyalty thinning like smoke. In the heart of the jungle, where fortunes were built on blood and powder, a network once untouchable began to rot from within. Power shifted, allies turned. The fall had already begun. The network once spanned coast to jungle, port to border, all built on the roar of engines and the rustle of foliage where coca leaves were pressed, dried, and packed for export. A single man, with quiet confidence, looked over a series of landing strips carved from the Sinaloa Mountains. The planes came in at dusk, engines low, loaded with product bound for the United States. The money rolled in unmarked trucks, hidden compartments, offshore accounts. In the old ranch houses of the Sierra Madre, bullets flew when loyalty collapsed, and alliances shifted like desert sands. Power walked through the corridors of villas and nightclubs, money waving in one hand, guns in the other. At first, there was scale and silence. The traffickers moved across borders with ease, bribing officials and relying on fear more than force, until the tide changed. Across Mexico, the federal government declared war on the cartels. The government's soldiers and Marines took to the streets of Culiacan and Ciudad Juarez, moving under flares and midnight searches. At the same time, U.S. agencies tightened surveillance at the border and planted informants inside the corridors of supply. Evidence emerged of tunnels beneath the border, of warehouses stacked with barrels of precursors, of labs in remote highlands producing ton after ton of methamphetamine. The skies, once dominated by a fleet of jets carrying tons of cocaine, became increasingly monitored. Radar caught flights. Satellites watched strips. The traffickers found the skies narrowing. Meanwhile, the empire's internal cracks widened. The kingpins who once sat untouchable in their concrete compounds began to feel the pressure. One lieutenant betrayed another, seeking safe passage in exchange for immunity. The trusted pilot vanishes, captured at sea. The accountant flees to Colombia under fear of arrest. The money flow stutters. In the city of Guadalajara, a massive coca paste shipment is intercepted. The safe houses, once bustling with guards and weapons, now see soldiers breaking down doors, shining lights into hidden rooms, collecting fingerprints. The once invisible web is exposed. The walls closed in on the cartel's elite. The man with the fleet of planes looked out over his hangars one night and realized the jets were no longer flying at full capacity. Engines sat idle. The laundromat of money, shell corporations, front businesses, offshore trusts started leaking. Investigators following trails of wire transfers found shell companies registered in Panama, tax havens in Switzerland. The suit-clad men in boardrooms weren't just businessmen anymore. They were pieces on a board being moved by prosecutors and task forces. In Mexico City, murmur grew that corruption was no longer a wall, but a gate. Earlier, officials took payments and looked away. Now, some flipped sides and took the stand. Back in the wild, where coca was harvested, growers saw their shipments lost, their routes captured. The jungle humming with soldiers instead of smugglers. Ranchers once paid for protection by the cartel now faced neither profit nor safety. And in the cities, the violence escalated. When rival factions sensed weakness, they struck. Convoys were ambushed. Gunmen with automatic rifles opened fire on escorts. Helicopters arrived at dawn with charred vehicles, evidence of roadside bombs. The empire's myth of invincibility fractured into chaos. Where once couriers delivered loads with precision, now they ran through alleys hunted by local police working with federal agents. The tipping point arrived when the man at the top was cornered. A government coalition, backed by U.S. intelligence, laid a trap in the mountains near his stronghold. The airstrip, once a launch spot for jets, became a perimeter patrolled by soldiers. Tracking technology, once unable to detect low, flying cargo planes, anticipated the next move. A raid on a storage site found tons of precursor chemicals for meth and hidden vaults stuffed with cash. In the chaos, the kingpin fled through a tunnel network beneath his safe house, emerging days later in a hospital under a false identity. His empire's infrastructure was already crumbling. The pilots were gone or captured, the labs dismantled, the financial networks exposed. What this really means is that no empire built on fear, flight, and forbidden riches remains steady forever. The trafficker's empire that once stretched from the Andes to the Arizona border found itself fighting on multiple fronts: the law, its own people, and the geography it once dominated. The harvesters in the mountains didn't trust him anymore. The couriers no longer rode with certainty. In the final hours of his freedom, he watched the walls of his empire fall one by one. The airstrips inactive, the safe houses empty, the towers of money replaced by the noise of court filings and prison doors. He moved through the darkness with a wound in his side and a bounty on his head. The safe houses that once opened their doors without question were gone, replaced by silence and fear. In Culiacan, entire neighborhoods that had once cheered his name now whispered it quietly, afraid of being heard. The Federals patrolled the streets in armored trucks, their weapons ready, checkpoints rising like scars on the city's veins. Helicopters circled at night, their spotlights sweeping over rooftops, searching for one man who had turned millions into ghosts. Farther north, border agents intercepted his last major shipment, 20 tons hidden inside industrial barrels marked as cleaning supplies. The seizure rippled through his network. Distributors vanished. Enforcers fled to Guatemala. Some took their own lives before capture. The lawyers, once paid in gold, now demanded their distance. The empire that had moved $1 billion a year now had no one willing to move a single crate. The man who once sat at the center of everything found himself cornered in a city he once ruled. He shaved his beard, cut his hair, and began to travel in disguise. He moved between small apartments, sleeping on couches, watching the news report the empire's collapse. The faces of his lieutenants appeared on television screens, some in handcuffs, others lying lifeless in the streets. His rivals celebrated, the press declared victory. But beneath the headlines, a quiet network of loyal remnants still worked to protect him, hiding money in safe deposit boxes and false accounts, bribing those who could still be bought. The DEA followed every rumor. Surveillance teams tracked relatives, friends, mistresses, and pilots. Cell towers in Sinaloa buzzed with intercepted calls. The task force, once uncertain of his location, now mapped his movement with precision. His pattern revealed itself: short stays, quick escapes, constant paranoia. Every meal was eaten under tension, every step a calculation. The man who had once commanded thousands now trusted only two. In early dawn raids, authorities uncovered vast tunnels under the city. They found chambers lined with power cables and ventilation shafts, passageways running beneath streets and markets. In one, they discovered his bed, half-made, a radio still on. He had escaped only hours before. Dogs traced his scent to the mountains, but rain washed away the trail. The military held their position, waiting for orders, while intelligence units scanned phone intercepts for any sign of communication. He stayed hidden in the Sierras, guarded by men who had grown up in the same dirt roads that raised him. Weeks passed. The government displayed his seized assets on television: gold-plated rifles, armored cars, stacks of bills in currencies from every continent. They paraded the fall as a triumph, but in the countryside, his legend kept breathing. Farmers who once depended on his protection still carried his face in their stories. To them, he wasn't gone, just waiting. And in truth, he was. His last plan wasn't escape, but recovery. He reached out to an old contact in Honduras, arranging passage through the Caribbean. The deal was simple safe passage for silence. But the message was intercepted, decoded by analysts in Mexico City. and passed to agents waiting along the coast. The night he tried to move, the rain came down heavy. His convoy, disguised as fishermen, left the dock under black skies. Far offshore, radar picked up their movement. Navy patrols closed in. The men on board realized too late. When the first spotlight cut through the rain, he didn't run. He ordered silence, hands still. But the soldiers fired warning shots, the engine stalled, and the ocean swallowed the sound of surrender. By dawn, the image was everywhere, the king of the mountains captured without a single shot fired. The arrest marked the end of an era. Inside a maximum security cell, surrounded by cameras and guards, he sat in stillness. Interrogations began. He spoke little, often only to ask for water. Prosecutors from 2 countries built cases that stretched over decades of trafficking, money laundering, and murder. The courtrooms filled with witnesses. Former allies now turned informants. Some testified from behind glass, others from safe houses under protection. Each confession dismantled another layer of his once untouchable empire. In the city, rival factions fought for control of what was left. With the old boss gone, the lieutenants turned on each other. The violence spread fast. Convoys exchanged gunfire in daylight, bodies left in plazas as warnings. Cities like Tijuana, Reynosa, and Juarez lit up with new wars. The balance of power dissolved, replaced by fragmentation. Smaller groups formed, each desperate for dominance, none with the discipline or control of the old organization. The routes that once ran smooth now became battlegrounds. Cocaine moved slower. Meth labs burned. Every shipment risked interception. The business that once ran like a machine now ran on chaos. In prison, he followed the news through whispers and guards' radios. Each headline cut deeper. The empire had not only fallen, it had devoured itself. Those he once mentored now fought like scavengers over the remains. The profits shrank, the influence dissolved, and the public began to see the cartels not as empires, but as remnants of greed and fear. The government took advantage of the shift, seizing territory and tightening laws. But corruption lingered, and for every captured boss, a new name emerged from the dust. Across the border, U.S. agencies declared the case a model operation. The extradition request was signed, and after months of legal maneuvering, he was handed over. Shackled and flown under heavy escort, he landed in New York to face trial. The courtroom was silent when he entered. Years of pursuit had led to that moment. Prosecutors laid out his empire in numbers, billions in profit, thousands dead, dozens of governments affected. They displayed ledgers, phone records, and testimonies. The defense argued violations, corruption, betrayal. But the evidence was relentless. After months of proceedings, the verdict was read: guilty on all counts. The sentence was life without parole. In a U.S. supermax prison, his world reduced to a concrete cell and a narrow window that let in an hour of light each day. The silence was total. Guards rotated without speaking. Meals came through slots. Cameras never blinked. Time no longer marked progress, only endurance. The man who once commanded jungles, cities, and armies of men now lived in a space no larger than the backseat of a car. Outside, the story continued to evolve. His empire splintered into factions, each claiming his legacy. Some used his name to inspire fear, others used it as a brand for loyalty. In Colombia, remnants of old partners adjusted routes to avoid exposure. In Central America, the corridors once used for smuggling drugs now moved migrants, weapons, and money. The system didn't vanish. It adapted. The faces changed, but the machinery remained. Governments celebrated victory, but those on the ground saw the cycle continue. In the mountain villages, old farmers still remembered the days when the cartel provided roads and clinics. Young men, without work, looked to the same paths that once led to fortune and ruin. The promises were different, but the hunger was the same. And somewhere in the silence of his cell, the man understood that while his empire had fallen, the world that created it had not. Years passed. His health declined. The newspapers moved on. A new generation rose in his place, born from the ruins he left behind. They learned from his mistakes, used encrypted systems, avoided the spotlight. The trade shifted. Less violence, more invisibility. Synthetic drugs replaced cocaine as the main export. Labs moved closer to ports. The geography of crime evolved. The empire's bones became the foundation for something new, quieter, harder to trace. In the archives of the agencies that once hunted him, his name marked the turning point. The fall of the traditional drug lord, replaced by networks that no longer needed faces. His story became a warning to some, a myth to others. Documentaries replayed the rise and fall, analysts studied the pattern, and politicians used it as proof that justice prevailed. But in the undercurrents, his structure lived on in fragments. Rotes still active, connections still useful, loyalties still remembered. One morning, deep inside the prison walls, he received a letter written in careful Spanish. It came from his son, a boy who had grown into a man while he was gone. The letter spoke of quiet towns, of people rebuilding what the wars had destroyed, of children growing up without gunfire. It asked for no money, no revenge, only peace. For the first time in years, he read it twice. The guard said he folded it neatly, placed it beside his bunk, and didn't speak for days. Outside, the deserts that once carried his convoys now carried tourists and truckers. The airstrips turned into grazing fields. The warehouses were sold to companies unaware of their history. Yet, in every corner of the region, traces of his empire still lingered. An old landing strip, a coded ledger, a scar on the landscape that refused to fade. The war had moved on, but the memory remained. When he finally died, the news broke quietly. No crowds gathered. No one claimed his body. The state handled the burial, marking it with a number instead of a name. But in Sinaloa, the night he was laid to rest, the sound of gunfire echoed once, far away in the hills, a salute or a warning. No one could tell. The empire had fallen, but the shadow it cast stretched long after its king was gone. The trade routes shifted. The money flowed through new channels. The faces changed, but the story remained the same: ambition, betrayal, survival, and loss. The rise of a dream built on powder and the fall that followed were written into the soil of every borderland that had ever tasted the price of empire. And as dawn broke over the mountains where it all began, the mist rolled through the valleys like memory itself, erasing everything but the echo of what once ruled the land.